Hello and welcome. Hello and welcome to Welty at Home. We are the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Welty with authors connected to Welty in some way. And right now we are concluding the series that we were doing on remembering Medgar Evers. So we've been exploring a series of works all connected by civil rights leader Medgar Evers. 60 years ago is the anniversary of his assassination, prompting Eudora Welty to write her short story, Where is the Voice Coming From?, which we've covered. We've also covered her short story, The Demonstrators. We've covered Margaret Walker Alexander's poem, Micah. We've covered the song Only a Pawn in Their Game by Bob Dylan. And we've had a wonderful discussion with Frank X. Walker on his work, Turn Me Loose, The Unghosting of Medgar Evers. And that's a collection of poems. So today, for our last day, our last week of this discussion series, we're going to discuss all these works in conversation. To participate, be sure to raise your hand using the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. I'm Jessica Russell with the Eudora Welty House and Garden, and I'll be watching for your raised hands alongside Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer, our friend, Professor Emeritus at Millsaps College. And she is going to be moderating the discussions today. And it is our tradition that at the end of this series, because it's the last series in our session, we are going to reveal the next series book pick. So watch to the end. And with all that said, Suzanne, are we ready to start our discussion for the day?
We're ready to go. We're not going to release any blue or pink balloons. We're just going to announce the book, right? So it's our reveal. I want to apologize in advance. I am operating with limited resources today because I was in Starkville and wasn't able to get back home, had a repair to make on the house here. So I'm operating with my Kindle and a copy of collected stories that I have here. So be tolerant of me if I'm halting and slow to locate page references. Okay, what I thought we would do is put these texts in conversation with each other. And because I'm the moderator, I'm going to start with the two texts I most want to discuss in conversation with each other. And those texts are Where is the Voice Coming From by Eudora Welty and Turn Me Loose by Frank X. Walker. And I wonder, do you see these books responding similarly to the past, to the way we need to respond to the past, do they make similar interpretations of the past? So let's talk about that. Anyone want to start us off? Where is the Voice Coming From and Turn Me Loose? What about the portrait of Beckwith? Here are two writers who imagine themselves, and Eudora Welty didn't know it was Beckwith, but she imagines herself into the mind of an assassin. And Frank X. Walker, knowing that Beckwith is the assassin, imagines himself into that person and writes from that point of view. A demanding, challenging task. Pearl, what do you think?
I'm sorry I missed so many other sessions, but I've watched the videos. I was astounded by Frank X. Walker's work. I hadn't known this, although I had known his York books. And I think he gets so well these different characters. And for the poem Anatomy of Hate, I have in my notes, it's on page 51 if we have our books. I have the note, where is the voice coming from? And because it's the same portrait of de la Beckwith. And as I read Walker's work, I thought back to my earlier assertion that I looked for the humanity in Beckwith, even though, of course, he is the assassin, he's a horrible person, but I tried to be open, but I'm no longer open about him at all. And I think that Walker does a great job of illustrating how brilliant Welty was in imagining the kind of person who could think like this and act like this.
Yeah, thanks. I think Anatomy of Hate is a good one too. And that happens to be the one, thank you, Pearl, I have up on my Kindle right now. So just went away. Shoot. I'll have to find it again. So Anatomy of Hate, and that sense of grievance that Beckwith felt, and that the narrator of Where Is the Voice Coming From feels. So let me just, if I can get it back. I have no problem with colored who know their place, but it's easy to hate troublemakers. An integrationist, uppity monkeys in suits and ties, little more than pet dogs for northern scum, pissing on our proud heritage. Yeah, I shot that boy in the back, not because I hated his color. I hated how clean he kept his car, his always pressed clothes and shiny shoes. I hated that he parked in front of his own house. I hated the sound of the North in the schools and books every time he opened his inward lips. The prosecution said he was only speaking on equality and freedom, but what I heard when he flapped his black gums was, poor white trash, lick our union boots and watch us do to your wives and daughters what the slavers done to ours. So what about that sense of grievance that's in that poem, where Frank X. Walker has imagined himself into Beckwith? Do you find that those same sorts of things in Where Is the Voice Coming From? Anybody? Yeah, Harriet.
Yeah, so much so. I mean, I was going to read the lines that you just read, but particularly, I hated how clean he kept his car. I hated his pressed clothes and shiny shoes. The image of the house, the image of the car, the image of the driveway, and the presumption of well, I don't have the lines here with me either to pull up immediately. It's the same, it's identical, and that sense of having bested him in terms of access, having bested the murderer in terms of access to a middle class life is powerful in both texts.
Yeah, that in the story, the narrator resents the fact that he's got a car. He doesn't have one. He's used his brother-in-law's truck. He resents the green grass on the lawn, and he resents the house that the narrator goes to. There's all of that sense of being, and he hates that he's been on TV and that he speaks eloquently on TV. So there is that. Those are all identical. Yeah, Pearl.
Another one I thought spoke so strongly to Welty's prescience and understanding and the choices of language she uses is the poem Fighting Extinction. We do what we do to build a fort around our women and to protect America from mongrelization. Allowing the free mixing of colored and white is worse than too much pepper on a bowl of grits, and so on. And my note says pure dissatisfaction is why he does this, and that Welty could draw up that kind of self-protection turned into hate, the fear that's turned into hate to cause the assassination. I mean, I thought Walker's work was just brilliant also.
Even that early in Where Is the Voice Coming From, the narrator refers to part of town he's going to be driving through. And he says, there could be reasons you might have yourself for knowing how to get there in the dark. And there's a clear reference to sex, to white men going to this black area for the purpose of sex. And then Walker is talking about that. His Beckwith character is referring to this as well. So, what you've afraid you're going to do to our women, what we've done to yours, that kind of attitude. Anything else here? The two stories. So they are amazingly alike, I think. Yeah. Other things? Other suggestions? What about the portrait of the marriages? So here's Welty imagining the marriage between the assassin and his wife. And we have Frank X. Walker talking about the marriage, Beckwith's marriages, both to his first wife and his second wife, Willie and what's Thelma? What's the second one's wife's name, isn't it? Yeah. Anything about the marriages? Pearl, do you have your hand up, or is it? Yeah.
I do. I'm sorry. It's because I was absent so many times. I have so much to say this time.
Keep talking.
Well, that was the next thing I was going to bring up, that Welty so brilliantly brings in the wife to show the sort of contrast and to show that she is implicated too, in a sense, because she's drawn into that world. But Walker is just brilliant to give us those other points of view that are both in sympathy and in their own sort of self-protection, in a sense. And as was mentioned during the conversations, I'm very much drawn to thinking about the wives from reading Gwendolyn Brooks' poem about Bronzeville mother. Meanwhile, Bronzeville mother loiters in Mississippi. You know, Mississippi mother burns bacon. She tries to go back to the fairy tale life. So for anybody that doesn't know that poem, I definitely recommend that poem by Gwendolyn Brooks to get into the inside of a participating demonstrator in the whole civil rights piece. But I think that adds so much more, and it balances being able to hear Myrlie Evers' voice and how she also was loyal to her husband, but we're more prone to, well, we do believe her and we do honor her, unlike Beckwith's wives.
I think the Welty's interpretation of the wife is different. Both of the marriage in both books are fraught. The marriages in both books are fraught, and the wives in both books are complicit. Welty imagines a wife, it seems to me, who's much more aggressively racist and sort of encouraging of this kind of not of her husband's activity, but of of the kind of hateful acts than perhaps Walker imagines. But they are certainly complicit, and the second wife is more so than the first. Yeah, Harriet.
Yeah, also there's the male-female relationship and the performing for the wife. I think I feel like in Where's the Voice Coming From, there is an antagonism that is kind of a disappointment in her husband, who is she sees the mistakes he's made. As he thinks that this is going to be a solution for the problem. But that sense of masculinity and of masculine performance being tied up in the issue of hate, I think comes through in both texts, but differently.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Anything else here? What about the whole question of individualism versus the need for approval, of it sort of acting out of a kind of social context versus trying to assert yourself? Is that a part of both books, do you think? Not striking a chord with anyone? Anyone want to talk about that? Well, I mean, I do think that as much, oh, they're good, Memrose. Thank you for bailing me out here. Memrose seems to be frozen there. There we are. You're still muted, Memrose.
Okay. Hi.
Now,
Hi. I'm sorry I've been absent the last 2 times too. I just missed it. I missed the conversation when I was. I was just wondering, Suzanne, maybe you might know the answer to this, and I don't think I ever addressed this either. Did Walker read Welty's story? I mean, did he say anything about that?
I asked him about it. I was hoping he would talk more than he did. He said, yes, he was aware of it, but then it was right at the end of our session and he didn't say more. So, but he did know the story, yes.
Okay. Well, I guess the thing I wanted to add to the conversation is both of the stories, I think, deal with white males' sense of disempowerment, the white Southern man's sense of disempowerment. And with Walker's work, and I think this has been touched on by Pearl and Harriet, but there's just this real sexual kind of in your face sexual element to that sense of disempowerment. I think it's in the imagery, it's in direct speech and so forth. Whereas I think Welty's story deals with that, but it's much more nuanced and subtle. And so that, I guess that's one thing that, that I wanted to add to the conversation. And back to the marriages, I was thinking also that, there's this beautiful poem about Merle Evers welcoming Medgar Evers home and they're dancing together, and that's just a beautiful, lovely, lovely poem. And it's in such stark contrast to Walker's poems about the wives and how the wives are participating or at least allowing the hatred that is happening in Beckwith's mind and in his actions.
Now, and in fact, I think it's Willie who says that he confuses desire and hate. And so the stark contrast to the relationship between Merle and Medgar, which is such a loving one, and then confusion of desire and hatred in the other marriages, and sex is a kind of assertion of dominance. Also, I think in Welty's story, the portrait of Merle, or the portrait of the wife of Roland Summers, is a very sympathetic one. She's waited up for her husband. There is that sense of a connection between husband and wife versus the conflict, the taunting that goes on in the marriage of the assassin, between the assassin and his wife. So that's the same sort of conflict, more fully rendered in Frank X. Walker's book. Other things here. What about the origin? Well, Pearl, you first.
I'd like to bring in the demonstrators into this too.
Okay,
and
good.
it seems to me then the way I've always read the demonstrators, and your conversation last week didn't dispel this notion, is, and even what Welty said about, this is the way we are being demonstrators, is that there's so much being demonstrated by silence, by complicity. And in Welty's story, the first demonstrators that I identify as demonstrators, are the men who are standing on the porch. They're not doing anything, they're not assisting, they're not even conflicting, they're just demonstrating that they're men and they're going to stay out of it and not do anything at the moment. But in Walker's work and in Welty's, there, what's demonstrated by the silence or just standing still, not acting. I mean, de la Beckwith is the one that acts, and he demonstrates something, certainly his hate. But the fear and the hate is everywhere in there, and I think it's so pertinent to today. You know, this fear of something different, and what do we do about it? And so, to me, this study helps us reflect upon our very current times about what are we demonstrating when we vote or when we don't vote, or when we march or we don't march, or when we talk with neighbors or we don't talk with neighbors, or with family. You know, we demonstrate all these things. And to bring my point back to the discussion, the poem by Frank X. Walker called Husbandry, in Merle Evers' voice, she says, I fell in love with his desire to take his fear, make Mississippi something stronger out of it. And then at the end, he spent every penny of his strength organizing for a hate-free day, and we didn't waste a single night. You know, that what they were demonstrating always. I don't know. That's kind of wanders around. Sorry, that's crazy me.
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing the demonstrators in. Frank X. Walker said that one thing he wanted to do is try to understand the origins of Beckwith's hate. And he thought, and he has a poem where he talks about him fishing with his grandfather and what he learned from his grandfather. And then late in the book, there's Merle imagines him as a young boy before he's been carefully taught, before he has become this emblem of hatred. And so you do have a sense of him as being the product of family life, the product of his social life, of need for approval from his society, of people gathering around him and singing Dixie or Welcome Home. Delay when he comes back. Do you have any sense of that in the Where Is the Voice Coming From, or is it too short a story for us to get that sense of the assassin's origins? What do you think? We have that scene where he talks about his mother. Yeah, Pearl.
Yes, I was going to bring that up because he talks about his mother wanting him to come home, putting the notice into the newspaper. So you have again another text that can be read, and how he says that the text, the message in the newspaper was just come home for nothing else. And so you have these generations that you also have in the demonstrators, different generations trying to react differently or responding differently. And so I think that in Where's the Voice Coming From, we do get a sense of his past. He has the guitar that he takes down, that he's no longer playing. He has his mother wanting him to come home. So he has a sense of that sort of pull. And Merle imagining DeLay as a boy just draws me right back to Laura McKelvey trying to imagine Faye's little brother. Is it a brother? Little brother. She imagines him as a boy. That's where it was.
Yeah.
You know, about
Her
the
nephew.
yeah. Okay. And so I think Welty's always sort of trying to figure out these generation. What does a generation difference mean? I mean, can you look back? Is it always nostalgic? Is it always romanticized? Is there some truth that can be taken from that? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think you have, to me, in the Where Is the Voice Coming From, you don't have a sense of this kind of hatred being inculcated from the family. Perhaps it was, but I don't feel that you really have that sense. You certainly have a sense that it's part of his society, and the world for which he wants to approve of him is governed by this kind of hate. Harriet?
I feel as if Gift of Time is a very generous poem, a very generous perspective on Beckwith. And I do think that it suggests that the hatred is somehow in childhood and in trauma and loss. I'm reading the lines. And he was was finally able to imagine that before he fell in love with guns, before he lost his mother and his childhood, before he needed a reason to hate, to feel threatened, to push back against imaginary walls collapsing in on him. It seems to me that the portrait that Walker creates is of a child that has been damaged by the loss of a mother, by the feeling of threat, which is very generous, I think. But an elaboration that we don't have in the Welty story.
Yeah, I think that's right. We don't, it's just not there. And I also think that's very generous. And I think, as he's told us, it was a very difficult thing to do, to go to that point. Anything else here? I was thinking about the whole business of dreaming, the dreaming poems, the poems Afterbirth, the poems Cross-Examination, where we see the Beckwith as a man who desperately wants his place in the white social order, who is not acting as an individualist so much as he is the sort of needy. He is a pawn in the game, in a sense, and that we're definitely needing that kind of approval. And the narrator in Welty's story, it seems to me, denies that he wants that, but he does want it, even as he's denying it. See, somebody else can get the credit, he says. He wants the credit, even as he denies wanting that. All right, anything else here between the two stories? What about Frank X. Walker's decision not to write in the voice of Medgar Evers, and Eudora Welty's decision not to write in the voice of Medgar Evers? What about the portraits of Evers in the two that emerge without their voices being heard in these two works? Stand out to Harriet? Whoops, you're muted, Harriet.
I was going to say, I think in both genres, we have a sense of Evers' accomplishments, of the reason that he is a threat. I think that the decision to not let him speak has something to do with the fact that we have silenced him. We have lost him. We've lost his voice. While I wanted to hear from Evers in one of the Walker poems, I think that it is true to our sense of a voice that is silenced. Yeah.
And in Welty as well. I think in Turn Me Loose, the portrait that Merle paints of her husband, the portrait of Medgar that comes through Merle, is such a compelling one, such one that invites our admiration, that focuses on his humanity and his heroism, and the kind of sacrifice he was willing to make given the relationships that he had, that he would be losing. And Welty, I think the naming of Medgar Evers as Roland Summers, here is the hero, the song of Roland invoked, and that sense of him as hero, as a husband who is loved, as a man who has taken great risk, comes through. But yeah, and in both, but as Harriet says, in both we have a sense that he's been silenced. Laura and then Pearl.
I just wanted to say also, I'm sorry I've missed so many, but thank you for always recording these because it really helps when life goes a bit crazy. Um, and I've been thinking a lot too about why we don't hear from Evers' voice. And I went back and I think it's something that you said, Suzanne, a while back that said that you thought that we get to know Medgar Evers' voice better by imagining how other people saw him. Or maybe that's coming from the introduction of the book. I'm not sure. But I was thinking a lot about that with this conversation, and that I think not hearing, we know what Medgar Evers was trying to do. We know what he was wanting to say. It's easier to, I think the harder thing is to try to figure out what was going on in the head of someone like Della Beckwith. That's the conversation to me. That's that bigger conversation that Frank Walker was talking about. I thought, and when he was talking about, that's the bigger conversation that he was hoping to spark. And I guess that's what's so interesting to me, is trying to figure out why. That's the why that I guess I think that we should be talking about.
The horror of it, and the desperate attempt to answer.
Mm.
How did this happen? Why did this happen? Pearl.
I
And then
was actually quite satisfied with Walker's explanation for that we hear. I mean, the whole reason he was assassinated is because his voice was so powerful and loud, and his actions were recognized, and that we could hear or see the recordings. We can see the recording of the speeches he made and already. But Walker does give Medgar Evers one other spot of speaking, and that's in the epigraph, which I was going to ask where that was from, because I do appreciate the introduction and the timeline very much, but he doesn't reference where that particular statement is from, which says, "If I die, it will be in a good cause. I've been fighting for America just as much as the soldiers in Vietnam. I do not believe in violence either by whites or Negroes. That is why I'm working tirelessly with the NAACP in a peaceful struggle for justice." And that encapsulates his voice sufficiently to turn our attention. And the next epigraph is a horrible statement by Byron de la Beckwith. "When I go to Hades, I'm going to raise hell all over Hades till I get to the white section." I mean, it's just ridiculous. But so I felt like we have heard enough, and as was just said, it's the reason that he was silenced, because we heard his voices.
Mm.
I don't know. I haven't. Maybe Minrose may know. I don't know exactly what speech that's from, but his speeches have been published, thanks to Merle. So we do have a good collection of that. Harriet, and then Minrose.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, we also hear him in the title, "Turn Me Loose,"
Yes.
And it's a different message. It does have to do with a sense of what he's carried, and of being ready to be unburdened of it. It's a painful line, but I'm thinking about that across to Welty's "Where's the Voice Coming From?", where I also have a sense of meeting Medgar Evers, Roland Summers, in the moment when he is struck. And I'm reading, "Something darker than him, like the wings of a bird, spread on his back and pulled him down. He climbed up once, like a man under bad claws, just blood." I just lost the page. That's reading on Kindle, you are at risk. But okay, here we go again. "Like just blood could weigh a ton, he walked with it on his back to better light. Didn't get no further than the door and fell to stay. He was down, and a ton load of bricks on his back wouldn't have laid any heavier. There he was on his paved driveway. Yes, sir." I have the sense of the weight that he carries falling to the ground, but also the burden that he has carried in fighting his fight, in living with this threat, knowing that at any moment his family might lose him. So I just feel his presence in that scene to the extent that I wouldn't feel as if he's not there at all in the story.
In that moment, I also feel it's the one moment in the story, it's ever so brief, where you have a sense that the assassin may have a sense of the horror of what he's done. And then he lets it go. It's gone. He's back exulting over it. It's all, but anyway, yeah, Minrose.
I think what I was going to say was that one of getting back to the way you started our conversation, Suzanne, and that was about the relationship of each of these works to the time in which they were written, and also to the past. And I think it's, really, it really bears thinking about, to think about how Welty wrote this story in a hurry. She wrote it in a flush of grief and anger, and she wrote it because she really wanted to understand where these kinds of where racism comes from, just like Walker does. But I think there's an element of, in Walker's work, just as there is in Margaret Walker's work, of memorialization. What is the function of memorializing Medgar Evers, and why do we want to memorialize him? Margaret Walker, of course, wrote her poem much earlier, but then Frank X. Walker did. But I think that one thing that Frank X. Walker was responding to is that before there was this kind of cluster of work and memorialization that came out about Medgar Evers, and that Medgar Evers' death and his martyrdom had kind of been overcome by all the other assassinations that followed it, and particularly Martin Luther King's. And so there wasn't all that much attention being paid to Evers at the time that Frank X. Walker wrote his collection of poetry. So I think the whole time issue between Welty's story and then Margaret Walker's poem, which memorializes Evers more directly than either of these two works do that we're discussing right now. And then Frank X. Walker's work further out into our contemporary time is kind of an important kind of trajectory to think about.
Yeah, I think that's really an important point. And the whole business of the memorial is an important thing for us to consider too. Micah was a man. And here is this memorial. And then Frank X. Walker thinking, he slipped from view. My students don't know who this is. Why don't they know?
Yeah. And may I just add one other point? I think with a great many of the assassinations of the 60s, and that the martyrdom of the person being assassinated becomes the thing rather than the person themselves oftentimes. Mm-hmm. And so I think maybe Walker was trying to work with that problem, or issue in a certain way too.
Yeah, and personalizing him, his relationship with his wife, making that so vivid. Jessica and then Harriet.
So I'm loving all these comments and tying into what Minrose was saying, and Harriet before her and Pearl before that. When I first read the title "Turn Me Loose" to Frank X. Walker's collection, I read it as the lines of a man in struggle. a plea, you know, to end suffering, or I read it in that light. And then as I started making my way through the collection, I started to see it in a different light, and I started to see it as how you know, whether or not ever's intended for us to interpret these words in this way, you could interpret it as a call to action. And so I'm thinking about the epigraph and the energy that he was trying to put into the world, and the energy that the Dillebequiths of the world are trying to put in, and raising trouble all the way through Hades. And so now that we're in a world where Evers has been silenced as a man, the myth of the martyr, you know, is bigger than that in a way. And like, what are we doing now? What are we demonstrating to turn loose the energy that Evers intended to put into the world? And that just became how I would think about it as I started to complete the poem collection.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah. Harriet.
I like that.
Me too.
Yeah, I was wanting to comment on pick up where Minrose was talking about memorialization and literature, and how interesting this project that we're doing is, that is looking at various retellings of an event, various imaginings. The shameless plug, I worked on a volume called Emmett Till and Literary Memory and Imagination, which also looks at various responses to the Emmett Till murder, not a Jackson story, but a Mississippi one. And at the time, it was, we were approaching the 50th anniversary of the trial. And frankly, Emmett Till was not on national consciousness in the way that he is now. Although at the end of the book, we had a list of 140 literary retellings of the Emmett Till story, which is amazing, given that it was also something that we had kind of obliterated from our national historical imagination. But and I think that list, if we were to make it now, would be 240 retellings, as now there are films and a television miniseries. But what we're doing here, we're looking at the relationship between history and narrative, and the way in which history is a story, and these different authors have told the story in ways that are both similar and different.
Yeah, so that the history as a narrative, itself a narrative that we're going to see in the context of fictional narratives as well. Anything else about these two works that we want to just talk about? I want to raise one other question, which my friend Susan Shands Jones can't be here today. She's selling her house, and she's at the closing. But anyway, she had said to me, she stopped me at the farmer's market, and she said, all these poems about look away, it seems to me that what the white people are doing is not looking away from the sins of the past, but looking away to the romanticization of the past, to the romanticized past. And my response to her is, I think both things are going on. I think that there is that sense of a white looking back on like Kappa Alpha fraternity and its Confederate dress and all of that, the romanticized past, that kind of thing. But also, I think the Frank X. Walker makes very clear that the white people of the contemporary, Beckwith contemporaries, were trying not to confront. They knew about and they wanted to look away from the sins of the past, so that it seems that both are going on. What do you think of that? Looking away, that line from Dixie, what is being looked away from here, or looked away toward? Are we looking, I should say, are we looking away or are we looking toward? Are we looking away from the present or are we looking away from the past? Yeah, Minrose.
Well, I think in Welty's story, as she herself pointed out many, many times, that she was looking away from the fact that that Beckwith came from a rung of society that was closer to hers than to the poor white that she depicted him as. So I think that her dissatisfaction with getting the class wrong of Beckwith, and so I think in that sense she found herself guilty of looking away from his proximity to the people that she knew and loved.
Yeah. Well, she did say, of course, that she knew what kind of voice it was. She had heard that voice. I think also, and I think, she said, I think it was Charlotte Capers who said to her, you thought it was a Snope, but it was really a Compson. Yeah. And then later Eudora said, but there's not too much difference anymore. So I think there is that sense too. But yeah, so that Beckwith's heritage was that plantation past. He was not affluent himself. He was he was living in a derelict family home, but his past was the Compson. And I'm kind of taken with my notion that he was Jason Compson. But yeah, I do think that's right. That and Bob Dylan saying, you're only a pawn in the game. But Beckwith was a kind of pawn, but he was not that much a pawn. So having that wrong probably a bit too. Yeah. Anything else on this topic? Anyone want to say anything about Margaret Walker and her poem Micah in regard to Frank X. Walker, or in regard to Welty and Bob Dylan, or Bob Dylan in regard to Welty and Frank X. Walker? Any final words? These are my last questions. What do you think, John? Poor John gets picked on by me every once in a while.
There. One thought I have is, for me personally, Dylan's work is the most foreign to the others, and what I mean by that, I just don't think he'd had enough of an experience of the Deep South or Mississippi to capture what happened and what was happening during that time. In Silver's book, the Mississippi, the Closed Society, I think captures, as well as anything that I've read, what it was like to be in Mississippi during that time. And he's describing a period of time when I myself was not actually living in Mississippi, but I was living in the capital of North Mississippi, which was Memphis. But even, that imaginary state line, there seemed to be a difference. There seemed to be a different attitude about race in Memphis, Tennessee, when I was growing up than what I understood was the attitude about race in Mississippi. I'm gonna wander, but I think it. No, I'm gonna wander. I can't imagine anybody more courageous than Medgar Evers in what he did. And being, you know, he's essentially, and that it was more courageous than James Meredith, because James Meredith was extraordinarily clever, and he knew that the Department of Justice, he said he knew that the Department of Justice was going to have to support him at some time in his effort to enroll at Ole Miss, and they did, and how he was, you know, how he could be that prescient about what was going to happen when that type of thing would never happen for Evers. And he was just a volunteer community organizer who just, it's remarkable to me how he committed his life to, you know, for lack of a better phrase, racial equity and racial equality. And I've not read any of these speeches of his. I don't know that they were available when I wrote the piece I did about Evers, which was the 50th year of his of when he passed, when he was assassinated, and I'll just stop there.
Minrose can correct me. I think that that autobiography of Medgar Evers came out around 2013, about the 50th anniversaries. Is that right, Minrose?
I'll have to look at my bibliography here.
Oh yeah, it's amazing to me what I've forgotten since I wrote my biography.
Probably about that time, yeah.
But one thing, there's such a contrast. There are like 8 different volumes about James Meredith, 8 different biographies, and I think there's still may only be one about.
There's one of Medgar Evers, right? Full-length biography. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Harriet and then Pearl.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about something that John said last time, and that is the way in which the demonstrators is a portrait of a segregated society. What it captures so well is what a segregated society is, how it feels and what it breeds. And I just want to say that about our literary responses throughout this series do that. That is, give us not only a sense of these individuals, but also of a segregated culture that is that they lived in, and that of course we're still living with in so many ways. But the power of that. I was thinking too last time about the connectedness between the story of the doctor's acceptance of Ruby's case as hopeless, echoing a story that I heard at the Medgar Evers house, and it's also in the Hollywood film version of Living, what is it's Us for the Living, the Medgar Evers story. And both in both places, the story is that the family hesitated to take Evers to white doctors for fear he would not be saved by them. And I think that's possibly an apocryphal story that has been, I don't know what Merle would tell, maybe Minrose knows, but that sense that, but it does capture the Black community, Southern communities' widespread and warranted concern about medical treatment, and why Siborian Hospital was so important, an all-Black hospital in a that it could be relied on to not take race into account, and so I'm just making that connection between the demonstrators and Medgar Evers by pointing that out.
Yeah, thank you. And Pearl, and then Minrose.
Just a couple of quick little notes. First, that the demonstrators is taking place, or is written anyway, more than a decade after Brown versus Board of Education. And there seemed to be no evidence of a change in Holden, Mississippi, or recognition of the legalities that have been passed by the Supreme Court. Secondly, there's a brilliant interview with Myrlie Evers, I think on the anniversary. I found it just by looking at YouTube. So if you put in YouTube, Myrlie Evers interview, and it's really astounding what an incredible, strong, and definitely honest, direct woman she is. And thirdly, just a little tiny note about guinea pigs in the demonstrators. Suzanne pointed out about the guinea pigs in the fortune teller's house and holding it, and Cheryl brought up the guinea pig in Cash's pocket. And when I was researching about Livy, I did a lot of rabbit holing about guinea pigs and came to the understanding that guinea pigs were a very easy and common pet to keep because they were cuddly, they were soft, you could put them in your pocket, you didn't have to train them to do something, you just pick them up and love on them, which you couldn't do with rabbits at that time because that was food. You wouldn't do it with dogs because they were purposeful for hunting, and guinea pigs were prolific, obviously, but also they would just eat food scraps. So there was no cost in that. And so that's why the guinea pigs were maybe there in common.
Thank you, Pearl. Minrose.
I love that. Well, I'm going to go back a few conversations to John's comment about Medgar Evers and his bravery. One thing is that Evers tried to enter the University of Mississippi before helping, asking James Meredith and helping him get into the University of Mississippi. So Medgar Evers was the first African-American person who tried to enter the University of Mississippi several years before, back in the 50s, actually, before Meredith did. He didn't get the support from the federal government that Meredith did, and therefore aborted his efforts, thinking that he could do better work doing something else, and he went to Alcorn instead. The second thing was that Michael Vincent Williams' biography of Medgar Evers was published in 2011. You were asking me, Suzanne, when it was published. I just looked it up in my bibliography. And let's see, there was something else I was going to add. I appreciate this conversation about the demonstrators because as I've told Suzanne several times, I've never really understood that story. And so the conversation is helping me understand it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank all of you for talking about these works about Medgar Evers. We've had a song, which is a poem of sorts, a book of poems, a poem, and 2 short stories. So we've seen several literary treatments of the past, and I think they bring that past alive for us. And as Frank Eck Walker says, that's the important thing. Never forget. And I think through literature, we remember most vividly and most enduringly. So thanks for joining us in this this venture. So I should turn this over to Jessica, who's going to make the announcement of our next book club, the reveal.
Yes. And before I do, Suzanne, thank you again for generously leading these conversations. Y'all, Suzanne donates her time to do all of these discussions for us. These discussions are made possible by not only her generosity, but a partnership between the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, the Eudora Welty Foundation, and the Eudora Welty House and Garden. So thanks for being here with us. And our next series is going to pick up on December 4th, and we are going to study Eudora Welty's A Curtain of Green. We will see you then.
Curtain of Green and Other Stories, 17 stories. The book of stories published in 1941. So we're going to work our way through them, and it'll be a really interesting and fun time, I think.
If you're already receiving Eudora Welty House and Garden emails, you will automatically start receiving emails a week before the first discussion on December 4th. So, but if you want to check out the reading schedule, we'll get that up a little earlier than that on eudoraweltyhouse.com. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.